Hello everyone. Hi. Okay, here's a quote. Some, talking about power, the powerful, some bursting with self-importance, and the other side, the powerless, having to suffer their way to future happiness or dignity, the right to be treated as persons, as opposed to those that count their happiness in terms of billions. Are they to suffer in silence? The powerless. This is from Dostoevsky. This is going to be the theme, my theme today. When I was a little girl, one of the things that I enjoyed the most was to go to where the women used to wash their clothes by the river and listen to them talking. It wasn't in the river that they did the washing. It was there was a fountain spring, and then there was a sort of a man-made pool there where the water was collected, and the women, there were stones. The women would get on their knees and they would wash their clothes there. And I loved listening to them. There was a little tiny hill there, and I would go to the top there and look down and listen to their conversations. Sometimes they would notice me. They would look up and notice me out there, and they would say, "What are you doing there?" Listening to grown-ups talk, and that they would shoo me away. But I would sort of come back, and that was like the town square, as it were. That was like the local newspaper. It was you heard them talking about just everything, about what was going on in the village, who died. Anyway, just about everything. Who got drunk? They would talk about their husbands, and who got drunk the night before. I specifically remember one time when they were talking about how they one guy had beaten his wife, and then they all got together the next day, all the women, and waited for him and gave him a beating, all of them together. Anyway, I think about those days, and I think my love of language actually, if I have to give a reason, it's certainly one of the reasons why I enjoy language and literature is I think I have to take it back to those very early days when I used to hear these it was like poetry to me. It was like just the oral tradition of storytelling. Tell me a story. They would tell these stories in this way. Another thing they did, these women, it seems as if I'm talking about centuries ago, but this was the 1950s. Another thing they did is that they used to burst out in song. They used to sing. While they were doing anything. They used to sing when they were washing their clothes. They used to sing when they were washing the dishes. They used to sing when they were scrubbing the floor on their knees, and they sang. It was really an expression of their emotions. The songs would be sometimes happy, sometimes sad. They were expressing joy and grief and pain. And I was thinking about this because we don't sing out loud anymore. We don't sing while we're washing the dishes. We don't wash the dishes anymore. The machine does it, or the clothes. We don't sing out loud anymore. We listen to music, but we don't sing out loud. we don't smile as much anymore either. We don't burst out laughing so much anymore. What's happened in Western societies? What's I don't know whether you agree with me here. Have we lost our sense of joy? Are we becoming numb in some way? Are we becoming... There's a sense of despair that is being internalized, I think. Have we become more coarse or hardened to human emotions, or certainly to other people's suffering? Are we all becoming a little bit more narcissistic, dehumanized? In some cases we see nothing, we hear nothing, or if we hear it or we see it, we pass by. Don't want to face it, it's too painful. What is happening to us? Because there has been a change, I think anyway. You remember Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, you know. We're sort of written in the 1920s or 30s, well before 1984, Orwell. But anyway, when someone was slightly disturbed, he or she would just take the little pill, the soma, okay, and become, everything was fine, you know, and went around with an inane smile, sort of robot-like. Okay, this is what I'm getting to. What is happening right now in Gaza is not natural. The violence, the cruelty, the oppression, the domination, that is really nothing new in human affairs, in human history. But what perhaps has changed, and many people have talked about this, is that we are seeing it in real time. And at the same time that we are seeing it, and it is possible, it is happening, we are asking ourselves, is this really possible? Is this really happening? Yes, of course, violence and cruelty has been with us humans forever in our history. And our ancestors and forefathers were violent, and very much so, as a matter of fact. People were violent in the past. So there is nothing new here about violence, but in the West, we had become used to not expressing that violence so outwardly, and we began perhaps to internalize it. Of course, when you internalize something, it's going to come out in some way or another, but not in an open act of violence so much. So it is kind of shocking us to see it out there so plainly. This violence and this cruelty that humans are capable of, because we had internalized it to a large degree, perhaps and it has to come out somehow. It has to express itself eventually. Perhaps that was the cause, anyway, of what is now called today mental illness, which seems to be happening with much more frequency to many more of us than in earlier times. Of course, mentally ill, there have always been, throughout time, mentally ill people. Yes, the insane or mad. We even had our village fools and the eccentrics. But what we now call mental illness, it goes by mental illness, is, I maintain this, that in many cases, not all, but in many cases is not mental but is spiritual. The spiritual affecting the psychological. There is a spiritual emptiness or deafness in that for many people it's as if the soul has become barren, sterile, and it bears no fruit, it has no life. Many people suffering from loneliness, and this loneliness and this sense of abandonment manifests itself in different ways. And at the end, we're talking about wounded people. And so here we are often angry, beaten, embarrassed, and eager to vent our anger on someone else for our own inadequacies, choosing to do so on those with emotions and desires similar to our own. And we also see this repressed despair in people's faces. The faces that, however physically beautiful they might be or attractive, sometimes they remain off-putting many times because their expression is unnatural and premeditated and contrived, leaving you with the idea that its true nature is not being shown. An everyday mask. Behind it lurks something nasty, something cunning, egotistical. We cannot trust it. People who enjoy ridiculing others and find pleasure in their self-abasement themselves, in their insolence, and in their lack of shame. But we have to look at them very carefully. Now, with our political leaders, for example, what has changed, I dealt with this before, what has changed now is that they are happy to tear off their masks, happy to play cat and mouse with us, believing us to be completely in their power. And perhaps we are. They seem to derive some kind of enjoyment, some kind of pleasure even, shocking us in our face. They seem to relish our horror at seeing the emperor naked. They seem to genuinely detest humanity and mock us to our face. I started with a quote from Dostoevsky. I was reading him the other day. The book I was reading was The Humiliated and Insulted. It's one of his earlier books. He wrote this book. He was always broke and short of money, and he started sort of a magazine, and he was serializing his works. So he was writing this, I mean, just to get some money, just to be able to sell the magazines. It's one of his earlier works, but it's obviously not the best, but it's still very telling. And he says, look at the example he gives when he's talking about the powerful displaying their power to the powerless. This is nothing new, but with the sense of with the sense of as I said, there in your face. They don't care anymore. There is no shame anymore. And this is what he says. There is a particular qualification to be derived from the sudden tearing down of a mask, from the cynicism of not even pretending to betraying any sense of shame, in suddenly exposing themselves to the rest of us, indecently, immorally. And he equates those in power doing this, the powerful, abusing the rest of us openly, equates them with, listen to this, with those male exhibitionists who take pleasure at the surprise, at the horror which we experience when they open their coats for us to see. He calls it this abuse of power, this taking pleasure in telling you that you are powerless and they are powerful. He calls it a selfish orgy of exhibitionism. And he gives us an example. Let me quote you the example. It's just a short paragraph. I'll tell you a story. There used to be a mentally sick clerk in Paris. He was confined to an asylum after he was finally pronounced unbalanced. Well then, during his bouts of madness, this is how he used to amuse himself. He would undress at home, stark naked as the day he was born, down to his shoes, throw a large ankle-length cloak over his shoulders, wrap himself in it, and, affecting a grand and self-important air, step out into the street. To look at, he was just like anybody else, a man in a large cloak, strolling for his pleasure. But no sooner would he see some lone passerby ahead with no one else about, that he'd walk straight towards him, with the most serious and profound expression on his face, stop in front of him suddenly, fling his cloak open and expose himself in all his glory. He'd stand for about a minute in silence, then cover himself up again, and keeping a straight face and with a perfect composure, glide past the thunderstruck observer regally, like the ghost in Hamlet. He would do this to everybody, men, women, children. Okay, so he equates those who are there on our face, displaying their power and their immorality, as exhibitionists, exposing themselves because they feel, like the passerby, it's a fait accompli, nothing we can do about it. Utter arrogance. I've dealt with this before. In another video, I sort of expanded a little bit on how arrogance leads to self-destruction inevitably, or to the sanitarium or the asylum, or to a slow death of drug addiction, because ultimately they are human and cannot face themselves. Not when they are alone in their room or their yachts or their islands. They have no joy. Remember the parable of the prodigal son? He left home, could do everything for himself, had a great time, spent all his money, and eventually ended up feeding swine. Had he not knelt down in humility, in other words, acknowledged his errors, he would have continued to be feeding swine, and perhaps worse. But he decided to come home and kneel in humility before his father, as so beautifully depicted in that wonderful Rembrandt painting. I think it's the Prodigal Son. I think it's in the Hermitage in Moscow. I'm not sure. Had he not admitted his to his wrongdoing, he would end up in a worse place than feeding swine. There is another picture also, a mental picture. There is no painting of it, no portrait. And that is when John Henry Newman, the founder of the Oratorians here in England, the 19th century, the Oxford movement towards moving closer to Catholicism. And there is a famous he actually waited for a Italian priest. I think his name was Domenico Barberi. Domenico Barberi was an Italian who had this thing that he had to come to England and convert the people of England back to the Catholic Church, to the faith of their fathers. Anyway, this was his thing and so on, but he took it very seriously, and he would preach in places and so on. But his English wasn't very good, and sometimes he would mix words, like he would say that Jesus came to shave the world. But he would, can you imagine how that goes down outside a pub when people are coming out? Anyway, but he kept trying. He had this thing about England anyway. But he seems to be a very sort of dear soul, really. And one time when he was here in Oxford, in Littlemore, very close by, that John Henry Newman decided to go and ask to be received in the Catholic Church. And why am I saying this? Because John Henry Newman was very famous in England. His sermons in St. Mary's Church, University Church, his writings, everything. He was at the time, in that period of the 19th century, really la creme de la creme of English letters, very much admired. And yet when he came to meet this pant-sized Italian, really with practically no English, he actually knelt down before him and asked to be received. That's another mental picture I have of someone leaving aside his self-importance and the applause, kneeling down in humility. Yes, arrogance leading to self-destruction. The question is, look, this is the difference between the upper classes of yesteryear and the ruling elite of today. They do not share the same self-confidence. If you can think of the typical, English lord, the typical English aristocrat of yesteryear, they took it for granted, as it were. They took their superiority for granted. It was almost innate to them. They didn't need to display it. They didn't need to shout at the servants, as it were. Okay, look, if I take a cab and I'm struggling with my suitcases and so on, and I need some help, I'll probably say to the cab driver, excuse me, can I ask you a favor? Could you please help me with these suitcases? I'm having difficulty managing them, and oh, thank you very much, and so on. An English lord would just say, bring the suitcases, will you? Okay. The difference is that the ruling class of... but it takes generations for that to be so innate. Generations of breathing, we used to call it. Yeah, yes, breathing. Yeah. But the ruling class of today hasn't had time to acquire this self-assurance. So they need to display is new money. They're upstarts. They need to display this power. They need to look how powerful I am. Look what I can do. They need to display their wealth. There they are, billions and billions and billions and billions, like the stars. Billions and millions. But because they are not 100% convinced themselves, it's easier to needle them by mocking them or by ridicule. It will needle them, it will make them feel... We need to mock them back in order to push back a little bit. This is difficult, but we can see the thing. However, the thing about Americans, you see, is that even though some people in America, I'm sure, feel superior to others, the good thing about Americans is that no one feels inferior to anybody else. That's very obvious, and that also makes them feel uncomfortable, in more need of displaying their wares. But what is true is that we see that both in financial, economic, political, and spiritual terms, they are leading us, they are moving us towards this one world government, one world church, one world finance, one world civilization. Think of the economic power of the United States and how they're using it. Openly displaying it. Think of what is happening in Gaza today. Think of Israel displaying their power. Think of the Pope in the Vatican, who is the infiltration in the Catholic Church is now complete by anti-Catholic forces. And the Pope, one of them, being there, creating havoc in the Catholic Church, dismissing bishops, priests, good priests, while at the same time, todos, everyone, he's just received some gender people, whatever. But he's openly, this is no longer hidden as it was to a certain extent in the 1960s. The infiltration has been going on for a century. We know that. In the 1960s, they destroyed the liturgy and so on, so that was the main attack, but then they stopped and sort of left it there for a while to settle. But now it's open. It's open. Is crucifixion almost of genuine Catholics who want to preserve the deposit of faith. And he's not hiding it, persecuting them. So here we are. They are out in the open for all of us to see. Not quite sure whether it is a sign of self-confidence or self-doubt. Not sure whether they are actually just saying, well, this is going down, so let's have a last go at it. But I think we need to start fighting back, and many people fight back in many different ways. But if we can't do anything actively, at least we can stop being afraid and start mocking them and ridiculing them. That's my talk for today. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.